Hey everyone, another 10-minute Marvel video. Real quick one today because with Loki coming out, I wanted to talk about two key concepts for Loki Season 2 and really for Loki Season 1. We just didn't know about one of them in Loki Season 1. So, what's been introduced is the idea of these branch timelines. Now, we knew about that in Loki Season 1, but what's creating these branch timelines is everything's branching off of a sacred timeline. This sacred timeline, I think I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the temporal loom. So we're going to start with, the sacred timeline because it's important to know that the sacred timeline isn't a timeline like a singular timeline. The sacred timeline is more like a rope. So a rope isn't a single strand. A rope is a whole bunch of strands twisted together. That's what's going to give it its strength. But you could pull apart each single strand. The important thing is that each single strand is wound into that rope. Because it's wound into that rope, it helps the strength of it. Now, the strength aspect for the sacred timeline isn't that important, but it's important with understanding how the sacred timeline is created. The temporal loom is how the sacred timeline is created. The sacred timeline, or all these timelines, are being brought into this temporal loom and twisted together to fashion this rope, to fashion this sacred timeline. Now, we've seen from Loki Season 1 that even on the sacred timeline, it's possible for one of the strands to kind of break off and branch off and go outside this accepted area of the rope, of this sacred timeline. In our rope example, this would be like the rope fraying. So, partial ways down the rope, one of the strands is cut and it starts to go off and do its own thing. Now, that cut rope at that point is weakening, that cut strand, I should say, in the rope at that point is weakening the rope at that point. It's kind of like taking a knife and cutting through it. You start to have, as you start to do that, excuse me, everything starts to expand. Like you cut a rope and you'll see that the fibers start to expand out. That's what's happening when a Nexus event occurs in the sacred timeline. One of those strands is cut and it's starting to branch out. Now, the TVA's job is to prune it. So the TVA is basically going in and saying, no, that cut didn't happen. It is part of the rope. It's fixing it. Because as you have more and more sections fray off, you're going to have less of a strong rope. You're going to have less of a sacred timeline to work with. So the temporal loom is trying to keep that all together. It's taking in time and creating this rope out of it. It's spinning it together under some condition. And some of that condition, I think, is being controlled or was controlled by He Who Remains. Now that he's gone, timelines are branching off. There's more coming into that temporal loom. So as it's trying to create this sacred timeline, it's trying to create this strongest timeline, well, it's having trouble. It's being overloaded. There's too much going into this rope that the machine that's built to twist the rope, to twist the strands together, can't handle it. It's trying to force more strands through than the loom can handle. That's creating a rope that is too wide, and just won't work. It's not going to be wound tight enough. It's not going to be strong enough. It's going to start to fray faster. But that's just kind of how I like to think about the sacred timeline, because I think the idea of the sacred timeline, often it's thought of like there's this singular timeline. No, the sacred timeline, and we saw this in Loki, is they're only pruning stuff that go outside of kind of the parameters of the sacred timeline. So in season 1, we saw that it's reaching the red zone. It's going up. Well, what happens if that Nexus event occurs and it doesn't reach the red zone and just kind of pulls back in? Then it's not something the TVA has to worry about, because it's still twisted in that rope of the sacred timeline. But let me know your thoughts on that. Does this analogy make sense? Does it help explain how the sacred timeline works? How in episode 2 of season 2 of Loki, X5 could move back into the sacred timeline without causing a branch? And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, coming up here about branches and how they work. But let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. And thank you so much for listening. See you next time.